A fateful evening, June 15, 2022, 7:45 p.m. As the summer sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow on the small town of Everdale, Ohio, Sarah Anderson grabbed her purse. Her husband James looked up from the couch where he was watching TV as Sarah put on her sneakers by the front door. "Are you heading out, babe?" James asked, his tone casual as he reached for a handful of popcorn from the bowl on the coffee table. Sarah adjusted the strap of her purse and nodded. "Yeah, I'm just running to the drugstore before they close. I've had this headache all afternoon and we're out of aspirin." "You sure you don't want me to go instead?" James offered, squinting at her. "It's getting late." Sarah smiled, brushing back her wavy brown hair. "I'll be fine, it's just a 5-minute walk. Besides, you've got the kids inside with cartoons to keep them busy. It's easier if I do it." James hesitated but eventually shrugged and returned his focus to the TV. "All right, but don't take too long, it's almost dark," he added over his shoulder. Stepping outside, Sarah inhaled the crisp evening air. The quiet street, lined with tidy one-story houses, was bathed in a calming twilight hue. She walked briskly, her sneakers softly crunching against the pavement, the chirping of crickets filling the silence. It was a route she had taken hundreds of times before since the Andersons had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago. The small drugstore near the corner always had what they needed, and the workers there often greeted her by name. Halfway down the block, she pulled her phone from her purse and glanced at the time. 7:52 p.m. Just enough time to get there before they closed at 8. She made a mental note to grab a quick pack of gummy vitamins for the kids while she was at it. Unbeknownst to Sarah, a shadow shifted in the dim alley behind her. The faint sound of footsteps echoed briefly but quickly blended with the ambient noise of the distant traffic on Main Street. By 8:15 p.m., James noticed the time. He assumed Sarah had taken longer because she decided to chat with the friendly senior clerk at the store, as she often did. But by 8:45, a concern began creeping in. The drugstore wasn't far. What could have delayed her so long? 9 p.m. rolled around and James was now pacing the living room. His attempts to call her went straight to voicemail. After another agonizing 20 minutes, he called the neighbor, a retired police officer named Rick, before dialing 911. "I'm sure it's nothing," Rick reassured James as they both stepped out onto the porch, scanning the still neighborhood. "These streets are as safe as they come, James. She probably just lost track of time." But deep down, James couldn't shake the unsettling weight growing in his chest. Sarah Anderson never made it to the drugstore that night, and she never came home. The shocking discovery of the body, June 16, 2022, 6:05 a.m. The morning light painted the quiet streets of Everdale in soft shades of gold, overlaid by a peculiar calm that seemed unnatural considering the chaos that had unfolded the night before. Out on Maple Road, an older man named Gerald Tucker, a retired postal worker often referred to by locals as Gramps Jerry, was making his usual early morning rounds. He carried a bucket of sunflower seeds, intending to sprinkle some behind the oak trees in his yard for the birds. His routine took him past the wooded area near Westfield Street, an area most people in the neighborhood wouldn't give a second glance. This was a place where kids played hide-and-seek during summer afternoons, or where neighbors dumped piles of leaves in the fall. As he approached the tree line, Jerry noticed something unusual. A patch of grass off the trail appeared trampled, as if someone or something had moved through it recently. Out of sheer curiosity, he stepped closer, his boot crunching gently against the dry twigs and leaves. Squinting into the faint shadows cast by the morning sun, he froze mid-step. A shape, a still lifeless form, partially concealed by overgrown brush and tall weeds, caught his eye. It took a few moments for his mind to catch up with what he was seeing. "Is that... oh no," he muttered to himself, his hand trembling as he set the bucket down on the ground. Forcing himself to step closer, Jerry could now make out the outline of a person, her figure lying on her back, an arm bent unnaturally outward. The messy strands of brown hair immediately made his throat tighten. Something about it felt familiar. "Oh God, it's her," he whispered hoarsely, his pulse pounding to the point he could hear it in his ears. Jerry had no doubt this was the woman from the search alert spreading like wildfire around Everdale overnight. Sarah Anderson. He backed away hastily, fumbling for his old smartphone from his pocket. His fingers trembled as he dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "This is... oh God, Gerald Tucker. I think I found her, the missing woman," he stammered. The dispatcher's voice remained calm. "Sir, can you confirm the location for me? Are you safe? It's right off Maple Road, near the wooded path by Westfield Street. I haven't touched anything. You need to send someone now. She's not moving. By the time law enforcement arrived, led by Sheriff David Hargrove, the neighborhood was already stirring with the news. Several residents gathered near the yellow police tape set up to block entry to the scene. Murmurs swirled in the air, blending with the early morning breeze. Detective Maria Ruiz stood silently near the edge of the crime scene, taking in every detail. A broken branch to the left, smudged dirt beneath what appeared to be footprints. "Get the forensics team to secure that area," she directed an officer sharply. "Who found her?" Maria asked as she turned to confront one of the patrol officers, who had just waved Jerry closer for questioning. "That would be Mr. Tucker here," the officer explained, nodding at the visibly shaken man. Jerry nervously twisted his hat in his hands. I wasn't looking for her or anything, just feeding the birds like I always do." "You did the right thing calling us right away," Maria said, her voice calm but authoritative. "Did you see anyone suspicious in the area before you came across her?" "No, ma'am. It was quiet. Didn't see a soul," Jerry replied, swallowing hard. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hargrove stood closer to the body, grimacing at the tragic sight. Sarah's lifeless eyes were partially open, her once bright expression replaced with a haunting vacancy. Her oversized hoodie had been pulled halfway up her torso, revealing bruises around her neck, deep imprints that clearly hinted at choking. "Strangulation," he muttered to Detective Ruiz, nodding grimly toward the marks as the crime scene photographers began snapping pictures. "But what's with the shoes? They're all muddy but the path's dry, looks like she was dragged here." Maria nodded, jotting notes in her leather-bound notebook. "Whoever left her here didn't want her body found easily, but you can't cover tracks perfectly, Sheriff. There's always something left behind." Behind them, chatter among officers revealed that Sarah's purse was missing. A couple of golden bracelets from her wrists had been taken, and a faint smear of what might be blood had been found on an overhanging branch nearby. As the community speculated from behind the yellow cordon, one older woman named Patty mused aloud to a younger couple beside her. "Everdale used to feel so safe. You didn't even need to lock your doors a few years ago. What kind of monster would do this? Poor Sarah. Poor James and those kids of hers." James Anderson, however, was already at the scene by then. Standing in utter disbelief near Rick, the retired cop and family neighbor, James shook his head violently. "This isn't real, Rick! Please tell me this isn't real!" His face was pale, eyes glistening but dry, as if his body refused to process what he was witnessing. Rick placed a firm hand on James's shoulder but avoided the clichés of false comfort. "I'll help you through this, James. But now it's the cop's job to figure out why this happened." Staring at his wife's unmarred wedding ring still on her finger, James whispered, almost inaudibly, "Who could hurt her like this? Who would want to?" As the coroner arrived to transport Sarah's body to the county morgue, the air grew heavier, laced with unspoken questions that the entire town knew were just beginning to surface. Initial theory: a robbery. At Everdale's county sheriff office, the tiny break room smelled of brewed coffee and stale donuts, but there wasn't a soul inside reaching for snacks that morning. The investigative team was gathered in the adjacent briefing room, its whiteboard covered in scribbled notes and hastily drawn timelines. Photos of Sarah Anderson's lifeless body were clipped to one side, alongside a map of the wooded area where she was found. Detective Maria Ruiz leaned against the edge of the table, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Okay, let's hear it," she said firmly, addressing the team of officers seated around the table. "What are we looking at here? Walk me through the theories." One of the younger officers, Deputy Kyle Bennett, cleared his throat nervously as he flipped through a notepad. "Well, the missing purse and stolen jewelry suggest a robbery gone wrong. Maybe Sarah surprised someone, a transient or a drifter camping in the woods. She fights back and things escalate." Maria murmured, not yet convinced. Sheriff David Hargrove chimed in. "It's possible. The path she was found on gets some foot traffic, but it's not unusual to see vagrants passing through, especially with the old train tracks nearby. The missing gold bracelets and purse do lean toward robbery as the primary motive." A small murmur of agreement swept through the room. Maria pushed back. "But let's not ignore the details. Look at the position she was found in," Maria said, gesturing toward one of the forensic photos taped to the board. "The scene was sloppy, sure, but it's almost staged. Her hoodie was pulled halfway up and her sneakers looked out of place, muddy when the trail was dry. Drag marks suggest she wasn't killed at the spot we found her." Deputy Bennett nodded hesitantly. "Right, but couldn't that just be the robber panicking after she died, dragging her off the trail so she wouldn't be found so quickly?" "Could be," Maria admitted. "But let's play devil's advocate for a second. If this was a robbery, why not take all the jewelry? She still had her wedding ring on. Why specifically leave that behind while taking the bracelets? And why not dump the body somewhere farther off-road, instead of a spot so close to a residential street? Sheriff Hargrove sighed heavily. You're hinting at something personal. Exactly, Maria replied. It feels messy, it feels conflicted. Whoever did this wanted to take something, sure, but they weren't thorough. They left things behind. That suggests panic or hesitation, which doesn't scream professional thief to me. Kyle took a sip of his coffee, then interjected cautiously, but couldn't it just be a rookie criminal? You know, someone young, inexperienced, and maybe local? Someone dumb enough to grab the most obvious valuables and run? The room went quiet for a moment. Maria nodded slowly, acknowledging the possibility. It's not off the table, but I want us to be careful about jumping to conclusions. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that personal motives often disguise themselves as opportunistic crimes. A robbery could easily be a cover for something else. Sheriff Hargrove tapped on an image of Sarah's bracelets projected onto the screen. What about selling the stolen goods? Let's say the robber's motive was desperation. Maybe they needed quick cash for drugs, gambling debt, whatever. We should check local pawn shops, online marketplaces, even gold-buying kiosks. See if someone's tried to pawn the bracelets or her purse. I've already sent officers to canvass the closest pawn shops, Maria said. And we've put an alert out for anyone attempting to sell valuables matching her description. But let's not forget this. The body placement. Robbery-motivated killers don't usually stick around to create scenes. They kill, they grab, they run. This killer spent time with the body, dragging it, positioning it. That's not panic, that's deliberate. Across the table, Deputy Jane Morrison, the team's tech expert, raised her hand slightly. Sheriff, I've been reviewing traffic cams and store surveillance footage near the drugstore. So far, no sign of Sarah entering the store that night. If she didn't make it there, we need to expand the timeline. Did her attacker follow her from home, or did someone intercept her before she reached Main Street? That's a damn good question, the sheriff replied. Morrison, make that your top priority. Loop back to anyone who might have been outside during that time frame. Neighbors, dog walkers, folks sitting on their porches. Someone had to see something. As the team moved to leave for their assignments, Maria lingered behind, staring at the photos. Something gnawed at her instincts. The scene had the hallmarks of a simple robbery, but the subtle inconsistencies kept pulling at the edges of her mind. Sheriff! She called out just as Hargrove was about to exit. Yeah? I can feel it in my gut. This isn't just a robbery. The sheriff looked at her thoughtfully for a moment before replying, then let's make damn sure we find out what it really is. With that, the investigation officially shifted gears, even as the surface narrative leaned heavily on the robbery theory. In towns like Everdale, darkness often comes wrapped in the most ordinary-looking packages, a local neighbor, a friendly face, or someone you'd never think twice about trusting. Investigation and early findings, June 16, 2022, 10 a.m. The Everdale Sheriff's Office buzzed with a frenetic energy rarely felt in the usually quiet building. Phones were ringing non-stop, the sound of keyboards clacking filled the air, and officers paced back and forth carrying coffee cups or stacks of paperwork. In the middle of the chaos, Detective Maria Ruiz stood over the crime scene photos spread across the table in the main briefing room. Her leather-bound notebook was open, the pages scribbled with hasty notes and bullet points. Next to her was Sheriff David Hargrove, sipping his fourth cup of coffee for the day. Let's break it down from the top, Maria said, tapping the table for attention. What do we know so far and what pieces are still missing? Kyle, start us off. Deputy Kyle Bennett cleared his throat, flipping through his notepad. The victim, Sarah Anderson, was last seen leaving her house around 7:45 p.m., according to her husband. She was headed to the drugstore to buy aspirin. Estimated time of death, based on lividity and the coroner's preliminary report, puts it between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Her body was found at approximately 6 a.m. this morning by Gerald Tucker. Cause of death? Hargrove cut in, leaning back against the wall, his arms folded. Strangulation, Kyle replied quickly. There were clear marks around her neck, consistent with manual choking. Whoever did this had to have been up close and personal. Maria nodded, scribbling in her notebook. What about the positioning of the body? Any signs of struggle, defensive wounds? Deputy Jane Morrison, the tech expert, raised her hand slightly as she chimed in. No defensive wounds that we can see yet, and there wasn't much blood at the scene. I agree with what the sheriff said earlier. It doesn't look like she was killed where we found her. The drag marks suggest she was moved, likely from another location. That's key, Maria said, looking up. If she wasn't killed there, that means the killer had enough time and confidence to transport the body without being seen, Kyle interjected. The path leading up to the woods is pretty dark at night, no streetlights for at least half a mile, perfect for someone trying to stay hidden. Still, Maria countered, whoever dragged her didn't do a perfect job. Muddy footprints at the edge of the woods, even the smudged dirt trails, sloppy at best. This person may not be as professional as we thought. What about the missing items? Her purse, the bracelets? Jane nodded and flipped through a list in her own notepad. Still no sign of those. I sent a general notice to local pawn shops and second-hand dealers, asking them to keep an eye out for anyone trying to sell a gold bracelet or a handbag matching the description. We'll need to follow up if nothing comes back. Sheriff Hargrove weighed in, setting his coffee mug down on the counter behind him. It's starting to feel like we're dealing with someone who wanted to make this look like a robbery, or worse, someone who panicked and didn't know what they were doing. Or, Maria added with a pointed look, it's personal. Think about how specific some of this is. They didn't take her wedding ring, but they took the bracelets. Why only those, and why leave the body somewhere it could be found? That tells me there's hesitation or regret, like they wanted her to be discovered eventually. Regret? Kyle asked, frowning. You think whoever did this felt bad? Not bad, Maria replied, but conflicted. There's no better word for it. It probably started as rage or desperation. Now it's falling apart. At that moment, Jake Monroe, the forensics lead, burst into the room, carrying a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a small scrap of fabric. Found this caught on a bush near where the body was discovered, Jake said quickly. It's a torn piece from the victim's hoodie, but here's the strange part. You see these smudges? He held the bag closer to the light. Maria leaned in, narrowing her eyes. What is that? Dirt? Or oil? Oil, I think, Jake confirmed. We're running tests now, but my gut says this came off someone's hand while they were dragging her. Could be from a car mechanic or just someone who works with their hands a lot. Either way, it narrows things down. That's something to follow, Maria said, her tone sharp. Jane, can you cross-check local repair shops, auto workers, handymen, anyone in the area who could fit that description? Jane gave a quick nod and jotted it into her tablet. What about the neighborhood? Hargrove asked, folding his arms again. Anybody see anything? Hear anything unusual last night? Kyle shifted awkwardly in his seat. No luck so far. Most of the neighbors we've questioned said they were in bed by 9. A couple said their dogs barked late into the night around 10, but their properties don't back up to the woods. Beyond that, just crickets, figuratively and literally. That's too convenient, Maria muttered. Nobody noticed anything? Not even a strange car parked nearby? Jake chimed in again. One more thing, you'll find this interesting. Near the drag marks, we found some faint impressions in the dirt that don't match Sarah's sneakers. They look like boot prints, heavy with a defined tread. Work boots? Maria asked, tilting her head. Possibly, Jake replied. I already sent the photos to the lab for comparison. If we can match these to a specific brand or model, that'll help us narrow down where they might have been purchased, or who wears them. Maria straightened up, her mind racing. Okay, here's my gut feeling, she said, taking control of the room. This wasn't a random hit-and-run robbery. This was calculated. Someone knew Sarah, knew her routine, and knew enough about the neighborhood to pull this off without being spotted. And that's where we need to focus. Let's start with the victim's inner circle, friends, family, co-workers. Then we'll expand outward based on physical evidence. The answers are in here. She tapped the stack of photos impatiently. Hargrove nodded in agreement. All right, people, let's get to work. I want a list of everyone who had access to Sarah's life by end of day. This thing is starting to stink of familiarity. As the detectives filed out, Maria stayed behind, staring at the photo of Sarah's pale, lifeless face. Her gut told her this case would only get darker the deeper they dug. The victim's husband comes under suspicion, June 17, 2022, 9:30 a.m. At the Everdale Sheriff's Office, Detective Maria Ruiz leaned back in her chair, surveying her notes with a growing sense of unease. The evidence was fragmenting into more questions than answers. The robbery angle felt weak, and no suspects had emerged who could convincingly fit the profile. One thing, however, had begun to tug at her insides: James Anderson's behavior. He was the grieving husband, sure, but there had been something about his calm demeanor when they interviewed him at the scene. It wasn't outright suspicious, but it wasn't exactly what she'd expect from a man whose wife had been brutally murdered. All right, let's go over it again, Maria said aloud, addressing the handful of officers gathered in the room. What do we have on James Anderson so far? Deputy Kyle Bennett adjusted his chair and flipped through his notepad. James told us he was home the entire evening watching TV with the kids, right? He said Sarah left the house around 7:45 p.m. and walked to the drugstore. That's consistent with what their 7-year-old daughter said when officers spoke to her. The kids remembered Mom saying she'd be back soon. Maria frowned, tapping her pen against the table. But no one can verify James's story other than the kids, correct? Right, Kyle confirmed. He was alone with them after Sarah left. Sheriff Hargrove spoke up from his spot by the window. He didn't come out to look for her until, 9:30 p.m.? According to him, he noticed she hadn't come back but waited almost 2 hours before calling 911. That doesn't sit right with me. Maria nodded. Yeah, let's focus on that timeline. If he's so concerned, why would he wait that long? Did he just assume she decided to hang out at the store until closing? Deputy Jane Morrison, the tech specialist, chimed in from her seat at the corner of the table, gesturing at her laptop. Here's the thing about James. He's been cooperative. Too cooperative, almost. His responses are rehearsed. When we asked about their marriage, he painted this picture-perfect image of their life together. But as we know, most picture-perfect marriages are anything but. Maria leaned forward, intrigued. You saying we dig into their home life? It's worth a shot, Jane replied. So far, what we know about James paints him as the quiet, stay-at-home dad type. But his reaction to Sarah's death, it's like he's shocked, but not devastated. People process grief differently, sure, but even their neighbor Rick said James seemed off. She made air quotes with her fingers. Rick? Maria asked, latching onto that detail. Rick's the former cop who lives 2 doors down. He's the one James called before dialing 911, Jane explained. Rick said James was pacing on his porch, but he wasn't panicked. He didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't even seem disoriented, just calm, like he knew something bad had already happened. That's strange, Maria muttered, jotting it into her notebook. What did Rick say about their marriage? Anything there? Jane hesitated, then pointed at her notebook. He said James didn't talk much about his personal life, but there were some arguments. A lot of them about money and expectations. Apparently, Sarah was the breadwinner. She inherited a decent chunk of wealth from her family. It sounds like there may have been some resentment there. Kyle blinked in surprise. So James was unemployed? Not exactly, Jane clarified. He did some freelancing online, work, but nothing consistent. Sarah's income was supporting the house. Maria sighed, leaning back in her chair. All right, so we have a thin financial motive, but that's hardly enough to pin this on him. What else? Kyle sat up straighter, flipping through his notes again. We did a preliminary canvass of the Anderson residence yesterday, and while James seemed cooperative, he got oddly defensive when we asked to see the master bedroom and the garage. Said something about feeling like we were treating him like a criminal already. Sheriff Hargrove furrowed his brow. He refused access to those areas? No, but he dragged his feet, Kyle replied. Kept making excuses about how messy everything was and how the garage wasn't even being used. It gave me bad vibes, honestly. Maria closed her eyes, piecing the timeline in her mind. It's always the husband until proven otherwise, she murmured almost to herself. Say what? Kyle asked, caught off guard. Maria waved him off and reached for her phone. Nothing. Look, we're not saying James did anything yet, but we can't rule him out either. His timeline has holes and his behavior doesn't match the situation. Let's do this by the book. We're going to re-interview him, and this time we're not just asking softball questions. Jane raised her hand slightly. Before we do that, what about the DNA results? Forensics pulled evidence from Sarah's body. If James left anything... Maria snapped her fingers. Good point. Let's hold off until the lab gets back to us. In the meantime, I want a detailed picture of their marriage. Financials, text messages, emails, the works. Let's see if James had any reason to want Sarah out of the equation. Sheriff Hargrove rubbed his temples and leaned forward. If he's got nothing to hide, he won't mind us digging, he said finally. His tone was heavy with the implication that this husband might not be entirely innocent. Maria shut her notebook and stood. All right, people, let's get to it. The answers are in his story somewhere. We just need to find the cracks. DNA evidence changes everything. June 18, 2022, 11:45 a.m. The Everdale County Crime Lab was tucked away in a nondescript building not far from the sheriff's office. Inside, the atmosphere was clinical, with the sterile smell of chemicals lingering in the air and technicians dressed in lab coats bustling between microscopes and computers. The gentle hum of lab equipment filled the room as the team finalized their latest report, one that would soon send ripples through the investigation. Detective Maria Ruiz was standing in the lab's cramped, fluorescent-lit meeting room, arms crossed, as Jake Monroe, the forensics lead, entered the room with a sealed evidence envelope. His expression was unreadable, but Maria had worked with him long enough to know that whatever he was about to say wasn't good news, or at least not simple news. "You've got something?" Maria asked, her eyes narrowing. Jake dropped the envelope on the table gently and gestured for her to take a look. "It's not just something, it's something big." Maria pulled out the lab report, her eyes scanning the neat rows of typed conclusions. She stopped mid-sentence, reading over the same line twice to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. "Wait, you're saying this DNA is James Anderson's?" she asked, looking up sharply at Jake. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's a match. We ran it twice to be sure. The sample we collected from vaginal swabs found on Sarah matches James's DNA, no question about it." Maria froze, her mind racing through the new implications. "So, they had intercourse before she died?" "Looks like it," Jake confirmed. "That sample is fresh, no more than 24 hours old, based on the condition, meaning it happened either shortly before her death or earlier that same day." Maria's jaw tightened as she processed the revelation. "He told us nothing about that, didn't even hint at it during the initial interview. He said he hadn't seen her since she walked out the door for the drugstore. Why would he leave this out?" Jake shrugged. "That's your specialty, detective. I just follow the science. But if you ask me, people only lie about things that make them look guilty." Maria grabbed her phone from the table and dialed Sheriff Hargrove's number. It rang twice before his gruff voice answered. "What's up, Ruiz?" "Sheriff, you're going to want to get down here," she said firmly. "The DNA evidence just came back and it changes everything. James's DNA was found on Sarah." There was a pause on the line before Hargrove let out a long exhale. "Are we saying he had a hand in this, or could this just be normal husband-wife stuff?" "That's the thing," Maria said, pacing the small room. "If it's normal, why didn't he tell us about it? He had every chance to explain when we talked to him. Instead, he chose to act like nothing physical happened between them." "Maybe he was embarrassed," Hargrove offered, his voice skeptical even as he said it. "Embarrassed doesn't cut it," Maria replied. "Not when your wife turns up strangled in the woods. He's hiding something, David. I can feel it." "All right," Hargrove said after a moment. "I'll call Bennett and Morrison. We'll bring him back in for questioning. This time, no softball questions. If he's lying about this, there's no telling what else he's keeping quiet about." Later that afternoon, back at the sheriff's office, James Anderson sat in the interrogation room, his hands clasped together on the metal table. He looked tired, his face pale and lined with worry, but his calm demeanor hadn't entirely cracked. Maria and Sheriff Hargrove sat across from him, their eyes locked on his every move. "We brought you back in today because new evidence has come to light," Maria began, her voice steady but firm. James shifted in his seat, his brows knitting together. "What kind of evidence?" Maria slid a printed copy of the DNA report across the table, letting it sit there for a moment before speaking again. "Your DNA was recovered from Sarah's body, specifically from vaginal swabs taken during the autopsy. Do you want to tell us how that got there?" James's face flushed instantly, his eyes darting between Maria and Hargrove. I don't understand. What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," Hargrove cut in, his voice sharp. "You told us in your initial statement that the last time you saw Sarah was when she walked out the door to the drugstore. You made no mention of any kind of intimacy between you two before that." James stammered, shaking his head. I didn't think it was important. We were married. Isn't that normal?" Maria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Normal isn't the issue here, James. The issue is that you left it out. You're not stupid. You know we'd find this eventually. So why not just tell us up front? What else are you holding back?" James's breathing quickened, his shoulders tensing. "I swear I wasn't trying to hide anything. We had sex earlier that morning before the kids woke up." Maria exchanged a glance with Hargrove, both of them noting the hesitation in his voice. "And that's it? You didn't have any kind of argument afterward? Nothing at all that might tell us why she ended up dead in the woods?" "No!" James exclaimed, his voice cracking slightly. "We didn't argue. It was just a normal day. I swear to God I don't know what happened to her." Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "James, here's the problem. Normal doesn't explain why your wife was strangled, dragged into the woods, and left for dead. Normal doesn't explain why you waited 2 hours to report her missing, and now normal doesn't explain why you never mentioned having sex with her that day. You see where I'm going with this?" James opened his mouth to protest but then closed it again, his jaw tightening. Maria seized the opening. "We're trying to work with you here, James. If there's something you're scared to tell us, this is your chance, because if you keep hiding things, we're going to find out anyway. And when we do, it won't look good for you." James looked down at his hands, his breathing labored. For the first time, real cracks were starting to show in his calm exterior. "Fine," he muttered, almost inaudibly. "There's more, but it's not what you think." Maria and Hargrove exchanged a glance, their instincts telling them two things. One, James knew more than he was letting on, and two, they weren't leaving this room until they got the full story. Uncovering the cracks in their marriage. June 19th, 2022, 10:15 a.m. The investigative team had relocated to a conference room in the Everdale Sheriff's Office. Its small oval table covered with folders, transcripts, and sticky notes haphazardly stuck to the whiteboard. Scrawled in red marker at the top of the board were the words, "Relationship Timeline." Detective Maria Ruiz stood at the head of the table, her fingers tapping against a file labeled Anderson Family Marital Profile. Sheriff Hargrove leaned against the far wall, his arms folded, while deputies Bennett and Morrison sat flipping through the printed statements they had collected from interviews with Sarah Anderson's friends and family. "All right," Maria began, cutting through the murmur of conversation in the room. "Let's talk about the Anderson marriage, what we know so far and where it starts to come apart. Morrison, give me the highlights from the neighbor interviews." Deputy Jane Morrison glanced at her tablet and nodded. So far, the Andersons were described as friendly but not close with most of their neighbors. They were polite but private. Rick, their retired cop neighbor, mentioned that James tended to stay at home more while Sarah worked long hours. His exact words, "You could tell she was the one keeping the whole ship afloat." Maria jotted notes onto her clipboard. "Financially speaking, she was the breadwinner?" "Big time," Morrison replied. "She inherited a decent amount of money from her parents a few years back, enough to pay the mortgage on their house, cover groceries, and everything else. James, on the other hand, was doing freelance IT work online, inconsistent gigs, low paychecks. Sounds like it didn't really contribute much to the household income." Hargrove rubbed his temples. "So you've got a power imbalance. One spouse is footing the bills, the other isn't pulling his weight. That's always a recipe for conflict. Did anyone mention fights?" "Plenty," Morrison said, raising an eyebrow. "Rick overheard arguments between them a few times. Nothing loud enough to call the cops, but enough to make him curious. He said one of the biggest topics seemed to be money, or the lack of it, on James's end. Sarah apparently wanted him to get a steady job, but James pushed back, saying he needed flexibility to take care of the kids. Rick called it tense but not violent." Maria scribbled another note. "Any mention of a drinking or drug problem, something that could have made James more volatile?" Morrison shook her head. "Nope, nothing like that. On paper, James is pretty clean, a family guy, a stay-at-home dad who got into IT after switching careers. But—" She hesitated, glancing toward Maria. "But what?" Maria pressed. "Well," Morrison continued, "Rick said James wasn't exactly thrilled about only having daughters. Apparently he'd made a few offhand comments to Rick about trying for a boy, and feeling disappointed when Sarah shut that conversation down." "That's weird," Bennett chimed in, setting his notepad on the table. "So he wanted a son? Could that feed into some resentment toward Sarah?" Maria's face hardened. "Resentment's one thing, acting on it is another. Keep digging into that angle, Morrison. What about Sarah's friends? Did they paint the same picture?" Deputy Kyle Bennett flipped through a folder and interjected. "Yes and no. Most of her friends described her as driven and independent. She was compassionate, especially when it came to her kids, but she didn't pull any punches in her personal life. Apparently Sarah had been venting to a few close friends for months about feeling like she was raising 3 children, not 2. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning she thought James was immature, unreliable. According to her best friend Erin, Sarah didn't trust James to handle big responsibilities, especially when it came to financial decisions." Hargrove exhaled sharply. "Let me guess. She was thinking about divorcing him?" "That's the thing," Bennett replied. "Erin said Sarah had mentioned divorce before, but she always backed out of the thought because of the kids. She didn't feel like putting them through that. Instead, she figured she could manage James until the girls were older." Maria paced the room, her mind racing through the potential implications. "So we've got friction, probably more than James let on. Financial tension, disappointment over family planning, marital dissatisfaction, but nothing concrete that screams murder yet. What about James? Anyone interview people close to him?" Morrison raised her hand slightly. "I spoke to one of his former co-workers from his IT freelance days. Interesting guy. Let's call him Theo." Theo said James always seemed pleasant at first glance, but had a habit of bottling up frustrations. He wasn't confrontational at work, but when things went wrong, he'd rant to co-workers privately. Theo said it was always about Sarah, how strict she was with managing their money, how she took over every decision. He called her controlling. "That all tracks," Maria muttered. "Anything else?" "Well," Morrison hesitated. "Theo also said James joked, not seriously but enough to be weird, about how much easier his life would be if Sarah weren't around." The room went silent for a moment. Even Hargrove's usual tough facade cracked as he raised an eyebrow. "He actually said that?" "Apparently, yes. Theo said it was one of those laugh but not really funny kind of moments," Morrison replied. Maria dropped her pen onto the table and crossed her arms, staring at the whiteboard covered with timelines and keywords. "So here's what we've got. James resented Sarah, possibly for years. Add in financial tension, power dynamics, and his disappointment about wanting a son, and you've got a cocktail of unresolved anger. Maybe that anger boiled over." "Still circumstantial," Hargrove said cautiously. "We can't arrest a guy for brewing resentment, Detective." "I know," Maria replied sharply, "but I'd bet my pension there's something else here. People don't implode overnight. This kind of tension leaves a trail. Texts, emails, receipts, something. If James did this, he didn't just wake up one day and snap." "So what's the plan?" Bennett asked. "We subpoena every record we can get our hands on," Maria said determinedly. "Bank accounts, phone logs, any recent purchases he made. I want background on every argument they've had, every friend they've confided in, and every word James has said about Sarah to anyone. If there's a crack in this marriage that explains what happened, we're going to find it." Hargrove nodded slowly. "Fine. But let's tread carefully. If we're wrong about him, this could blow up in our faces." Maria didn't flinch. Her instincts were screaming that James wasn't the innocent, grieving husband he appeared to be. "Then let's make sure we're not wrong," she said grimly. As the team scattered to their assignments, Maria stayed behind, staring at the board. She couldn't help but think that beneath all the layers of tension and excuses, someone like James might convince himself he was a victim, and victims, she knew too well, sometimes lash out in the darkest ways imaginable. A shocking discovery at the family home, June 20th, 2022, 8:15 a.m. The Anderson residence, once a picturesque suburban home with a neatly trimmed front yard and a swing set still swaying softly in the morning breeze, had become a crime scene. Yellow police tape wrapped the premises like a sordid veil, a stark contrast to the homey facade. Detective Maria Ruiz and Sheriff David Hargrove stood near the garage, their faces set with sharp focus as officers in gloves and booties moved in and out of the house. "Let me guess," Hargrove muttered, adjusting his hat against the morning glare. "James didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat when we showed up with a search warrant?" Maria smirked grimly, arms crossed as she watched Deputy Bennett carefully inspect the garage's shelving units. "Not even close. He told us we were wasting his time and tormenting his family. But, well, James isn't great at concealing nerves when we show up unannounced." Hargrove raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. "How so?" "He was sweating like a pig," Maria replied flatly. "Kept asking if we'd be finished soon, which of course made it very clear we were onto something." Inside the house, Deputy Jane Morrison's voice cut through on the radio. "Detectives, you're gonna want to see this. Upstairs, master bedroom closet." Maria and Hargrove exchanged a knowing look before quickly heading up the narrow staircase to the second floor. 8:22 a.m. Master bedroom closet. The master bedroom smelled faintly of cedar wood from an aging bedside diffuser. Clothes still neatly hung in the closet, seemingly untouched since the night Sarah disappeared, swayed slightly as Maria pushed a row of garments aside to get a clearer view. Morrison stood on a step stool, holding something in her gloved hand, something shiny. "These were stuffed in a shoebox on the top shelf," Morrison said, holding up a gold bracelet and a delicate chain necklace. "Recognize them?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need a photo to know these were Sarah's. She'd worn the bracelet in countless pictures they'd seen during the investigation. The necklace, engraved with the initials S.A., had been a gift Sarah received from her parents. "That's them," Maria confirmed aloud, her voice tight, her tone dropped as the implications hit her. "He said she had them on her when she went to the drugstore. Why are they here?" "He hid them," Morrison's voice was certain, though grim. "James knew we'd be looking for these. If it was just robbery like he claimed, why wouldn't the thief have taken it all? Why hide his own wife's jewelry in the closet unless he knew it would incriminate him?" Sheriff Hargrove, leaning against the doorframe, let out a low whistle. "He's lying, and badly." Maria nodded solemnly. "He's trying to have it both ways. Pin this on some imaginary thief but doesn't want to part with the valuables. It's arrogance. Pure arrogance." But before she could dwell on the thought, Morrison pointed toward the gloved officer digging through storage bins on the closet floor. "That's not all. You might want to take a look at this next." The officer carefully handed Maria a heavy, dark-stained canvas bag. It was old, weathered, and gave off an odd, metallic smell that immediately set Maria on edge. She unfolded the bag and gasped quietly. Inside the bag were what appeared to be faint, rust-colored stains, and when she dabbed at one of them with a swab, it came back a deep crimson. "Blood," Maria stated, her voice chillingly calm. Morrison blinked, then reached for her tablet, already typing notes. "We'll send it to the lab for confirmation, but, yeah, looks like it, and if it matches Sarah—" Maria finished the thought for her. "Then this is the bag he used to move her body." Hargrove stepped closer, his brow furrowing as he surveyed the scene. "So, first he hides her jewelry, then he tucks away a blood-stained bag in the closet. What exactly did he think was going to happen here? That we'd just leave it at the robbery angle and call it a day?" "He thought we wouldn't dig this far," Maria replied, her voice edged with disdain. "He's smarter than the average guy, but not nearly as smart as he thinks he is. Arrogance will always trip them up." Bennett appeared in the doorway, catching his breath from searching the rest of the house. "Garage is mostly clean, but we found something else. There's a patch near the rear corner of the yard, freshly turned soil. The neighbor claims James was back there the day after Sarah went missing, digging up God knows what. Guerrero's out there now taking samples." Maria narrowed her eyes. "He's panicking. If he didn't think we'd find the jewelry, he definitely didn't think we'd check his yard. What else is this man hiding?" 8:45 a.m. Backyard Guerrero, another officer from the forensic team, stood over a small patch of freshly dug earth by the fence line, shovel in hand. Around him were several clear bags containing fragments of discarded belongings, a torn scrap of fabric, what looked like burnt paper scraps, and a singed photo. Maria crouched down to inspect one of the bags. The singed photo, once fully intact, was just barely recognizable. It depicted James and Sarah from years ago, smiling and holding hands. Except Sarah's face had been deliberately burned through with the flame. Maria's stomach tightened at the sight of it. "This keeps getting better and better," Hargrove muttered, kneeling beside her. "What's the story here? Guilt? Anger? Some combination of both?" "Anger," Maria said quietly, standing back up and staring at the yard. "The more we dig, the more this looks like premeditation. At some point James went from panicked to deliberate. He thought he could erase her, hide the evidence, rewrite the story. But people like him always underestimate the details." "DNA will tell us everything," Morrison added, walking over to join them. "Between the bag and this pile, we've got enough for a solid case. He's toast." Maria nodded, but the weight in her chest told her it wasn't exactly a win. Not yet. "Let's get this all analyzed and make it airtight. He's not wriggling out of this one, but I want to make sure there's no way his lawyer can spin it." Hargrove clapped Guerrero on the back. "Bag everything, get it to the lab. And someone get that husband back in for questioning. We need to see how well this story holds up under pressure." Maria glanced back at the house, the taped-off scene that now felt heavier than ever. James Anderson wasn't just a suspect now. He was a liar, and almost certainly a killer. But she wasn't going to let him take another breath of smug self-assurance. "This isn't over," she said under her breath. "Not until Sarah gets the justice she deserves." The shocking confession. June 21, 2022, 7:45 p.m. The interrogation room in the Everdale Sheriff's Office had seen its fair share of suspects over the years, but none as tense as James Anderson. The walls seemed to close in as the overhead fluorescent light buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across his pale, sweat-covered face. He sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as if holding on to some last shred of control. Across from him, Detective Maria Ruiz and Sheriff David Hargrove exchanged a silent glance, each reading the other's instincts without saying a word. This was it. This was the moment they'd prepared for with every piece of evidence they'd pulled from the house, the yard, and the crime lab. James was cornered, and everyone in the room knew it. Maria opened the manila folder in front of her, neatly spreading out photographs. Sarah's jewelry, the blood-stained canvas bag, the burned photo. Each image was placed deliberately, like chess pieces facing James. She leaned back in her seat, letting the gravity of the imagery settle in before speaking. "We've got a lot to talk about, James," Maria began, her voice calm but cutting. "We found Sarah's bracelet in your closet. We found a bag with her blood on it, blood that matches hers perfectly, and let's not forget the little patch of soil in your backyard. Care to explain any of it?" James looked up, his face contorting into a mix of frustration and fear. I already told you I don't know how any of that got there, he stammered. Hargrove let out a low, unimpressed chuckle and leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. Come on, James, don't insult us. You think some random thief planted all of that in your house, dug up your yard, used your bag? This isn't a mystery novel. We deal in facts, not fantasies. James straightened up in his chair, his jaw tightening. What do you want me to say? That I killed her? I didn't. His voice cracked, the desperation bleeding through his words. Maria stayed silent for a moment, letting the tension hang thick in the air before she spoke. You know what doesn't add up, James? The timeline. Sarah leaves the house and then, what? A thief swoops in, kills her, and on their way out, lovingly places her jewelry in your closet? Not to mention, the thief just so happens to use a bag from your garage to move her body? She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Or maybe the thief didn't exist. Maybe this has nothing to do with them. Maybe it's all you. James's eyes darted between Maria, Hargrove, and the photographs. His hands clenched into shaky fists. He muttered something under his breath that neither detective could hear clearly. What was that, James? Maria pressed, her voice soft but insistent. He exhaled sharply, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Fine, I hid the damn jewelry, okay, but that doesn't mean I killed her. Why would you hide her jewelry? Hargrove pressed, his voice rising. Why, James? If you didn't kill her, why are you covering up evidence? I panicked, James shouted suddenly, his voice hoarse. I didn't know what to do. When I realized she wasn't coming back, I freaked out, all right? I didn't want them to lose both parents. Maria tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady on him. So, you panicked and hid her jewelry in a shoebox? You panicked and stuffed a bloody bag in your closet? You panicked and burned photos of her in your yard? Her tone was razor sharp, cutting through his excuses. James's face crumpled, his defenses starting to crack. He shook his head slowly, tears welling in his eyes. You don't understand how much pressure I was under. There it is, Maria said quietly, leaning in like a predator circling its prey. The pressure. Why don't you tell us about that? What kind of pressure makes a man go from scared husband to... She gestured to the photos spread out in front of him. This? James sat silently, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shaky breaths. He stared at the table, refusing to meet their eyes, as though the weight of their accusations had finally crushed something inside him. You'll feel better if you just tell the truth, James, Hargrove said, his voice deceptively calm now. This whole mess, it'll eat you alive if you don't come clean. The evidence is there, the timeline's there, you're not getting out of this. For what felt like an eternity, James said nothing. Then he let out a guttural sob, his body shaking under the weight of his confession. It wasn't supposed to happen, he cried out suddenly, his voice raw with anguish. Maria and Hargrove locked eyes briefly, both suppressing the instinct to react too strongly. This was it. They had him. What wasn't supposed to happen, James? Maria asked softly, her tone almost maternal now. She kept pushing me, he choked out. The money, the job, the constant judgment. I felt like a failure every day, like I wasn't good enough for her or the kids. So you killed her, Maria said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. I didn't mean to, James shouted, tears streaming down his face. We started arguing that night, about the job, about the bills. She said she was tired of always carrying me, of me being just another child she had to take care of, and I snapped. How, James? Hargrove asked firmly, gripping the edge of his chair. How did you snap? I grabbed her, James stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even realize what I was doing. My hands were on her neck and... His voice broke completely as his head fell into his hands, sobs racking his body. Maria's expression didn't soften. And then she was dead. James nodded wordlessly, his shoulders sagging under the admission. And after you killed her? Hargrove prompted, his tone harsher now. What did you do then, James? I panicked, James gasped, his words coming out in fragmented, broken sentences. I dragged her body, put it in the bag from the garage. I didn't know where to take her, so The woods were close. I thought if I left her there, someone else would find her and it wouldn't come back to me. But it did come back to you, Maria said coldly, pushing the photographs toward him. Because you left a trail, and people like you always do. James buried his face in his hands, his tears muffling his words. I didn't want to. It was an accident. She was supposed to be my wife. I loved her. I didn't know how to fix it. Maria stood slowly, her expression unreadable. Well, James, she said quietly, now it's our job to fix it, and you're going exactly where you belong. With that, She and Hargrove walked out of the room, leaving James alone to face the full weight of his actions. A sinister motive. June 22, 2022, 10 a.m. The interrogation room felt colder than usual. Perhaps it was the weight of what had been said in the past 48 hours, or maybe it was the stony absence of denial from James Anderson now. He was no longer the defiant, grieving husband. He had confessed to the act, strangling his wife, Sarah, but questions still lingered. Why? Detective Maria Ruiz sat across from him again, this time armed not only with evidence, but with the psychological leverage to dig into his motives. Sheriff David Hargrove stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed, his steady gaze fixed on James, who sat slumped in his chair. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, the knuckles white, as though he were gripping a ghost he couldn't let go of. Maria leaned forward, her voice calm but laced with intent. "James, you've told us how it happened, but we need to understand why. Why did it come to this? What was it that made you do the unthinkable?" James shook his head slowly, avoiding her eyes. "I already told you. I panicked. It wasn't intentional." Maria tilted her head, her voice soft but firm. "Come on, James, you don't panic and choke someone to death. That takes minutes, not seconds. Panic lasts an instant. Crimes like this take time. You had to make a decision. So what was it? What were you thinking when your hands were around her neck?" The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. James swallowed hard. Hargrove finally stepped forward, his tone sharper. "Look, James, you confessed to killing her. That cat's already out of the bag. But what we're trying to figure out now is why. Because if we leave it at your little panic attack theory, a jury's going to chew you up and spit you out. So why don't you tell us the truth about what pushed you over the edge?" James looked up at Hargrove, his red-rimmed eyes glistening with a mix of anger and fear. "She didn't stop," he said quietly. Maria raised an eyebrow, leaning further forward. "Didn't stop what?" James's voice cracked as he spoke, his words coming out in bursts. "Judging me, belittling me. Every single day I was reminded that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't pulling my weight. Do you know what it's like to feel like a failure in your own home? To feel like you're just there? Like you don't matter?" Maria exchanged a glance with Hargrove but kept her tone even. "So, you felt like Sarah didn't respect you. Is that what you're saying?" James laughed bitterly, running his hands through his hair. "Respect me? She'd stopped respecting me years ago. Hell, I don't think she ever did. To her, I was just the guy who stayed home, made dinner and folded laundry while she called the shots. She made the money, she made the rules, and I was nothing." Maria's eyes remained locked on him. "You were her husband, James. The father of her children. That's not nothing." James let out a sharp breath, his eyes flashing with a mix of resentment and guilt. "She didn't see it that way. It didn't matter what I did. Nothing was good enough. The freelance jobs weren't stable enough, the house wasn't clean enough, the kids weren't. I wasn't good enough for her." "All right," Hargrove interjected, his voice firm. "So you felt this way. But a lot of people feel overlooked in their marriages, James. Most of them don't kill their wives over it. What made you cross the line?" The room went silent again and James's face darkened. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost inaudible. "The money, that's what it always came back to." Maria leaned in, her pen hovering over her notebook. "What do you mean, the money? Be specific." James clenched his fist in his lap, his jaw tightening. "Sarah held all the power because she controlled the money, her inheritance, her income. It wasn't ours, it was hers. And she never let me forget it. Even when it came to decisions about the kids or the house, she had the final say because, as she loved to remind me, she was the one who paid for it all." Maria's voice softened slightly, though her gaze stayed piercing. "And that made you angry, resentful." James laughed bitterly again. "Of course it did. How could it not? I wasn't her husband. I was her charity project." "What about the divorce?" Maria pressed. "Did Sarah bring it up? Were you worried about losing more than just her?" James froze, his eyes darting to Maria. For the first time he looked truly panicked. "You were," Maria continued, her voice sharpening. "You knew if she divorced you, you'd lose everything. The house, the money, the kids. She'd get full custody, wouldn't she? That scared you, didn't it?" James's voice was barely above a whisper. She was going to take it all. She said I wouldn't have a dime if I didn't step up, that I'd have to start over with nothing." Hargrove leaned in now, his voice cold and direct. "So you killed her to stop it? You decided it was easier to get rid of her than to deal with starting over, is that it?" James's head snapped up, his eyes filling with tears. "No, I didn't plan it, it just happened. We were fighting about the bills again, and she said it. She said I was a parasite, that everything I had was because of her. I couldn't take it anymore." Maria's voice was calm but unwavering. And that's when you snapped. James nodded slowly, his tears sliding silently down his face. She wouldn't stop yelling. I told her I was trying, but she didn't care. She just kept going, saying I wasn't a man, that she carried this family, that I'd never... His voice broke and he buried his face in his hands. Maria leaned back in her chair, her pen still hovering over her notebook. She'd heard enough. You couldn't handle the thought of losing the control you barely had, James. That's what this was about. You didn't kill Sarah because you panicked. You killed her because you couldn't stand the idea of her winning, of her taking the kids, the house, the money and walking away while you were left with nothing. James didn't respond. He just sat there, his body shaking with quiet sobs. Hargrove straightened up, his tone as cold as ice. You didn't just kill your wife, James. You killed the mother of your children. And for what? Pride, money, control? I hope it was worth it, because now you've lost everything anyway. Maria closed her notebook and stood, her gaze never leaving James's broken figure. The jury's going to want to hear that story, James. I'd start thinking about how you're going to tell it. With that, she and Hargrove walked out of the room, leaving James alone to reckon with the full weight of what he had done. The trial and a harsh sentence, May 15, 2023, 9 a.m. The courtroom was packed, the murmur of the crowd muffled as the heavy oak doors shut behind James Anderson. Shackled and escorted by 2 deputies, he entered with a bowed head and the hollow stare of a man who had not slept in days. The rows toward the back were filled with reporters, their pens poised over notebooks, while the front rows were occupied by Sarah Anderson's family and friends. Their faces wore a unified expression of anguish and determination. Detective Maria Ruiz was seated on the left side of the gallery next to Sheriff David Hargrove. She clutched her notepad, watching carefully as James lowered himself into the defendant's chair. The sheer anticipation of the trial's outcome hung in the air like a thunder cloud. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice booming. All rise! The Honorable Judge Elizabeth Carter presiding. The room quieted immediately as Judge Carter, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, entered and sat at the bench. Be seated, she instructed. Then her eyes fell on James, who sat quietly with his public defender, whispering into his ear. Mr. Anderson, you are here today to answer to the charge of first-degree murder. How do you plead? James raised his eyes momentarily, his voice barely audible. Guilty, Your Honor. The room was silent for a beat, the air thick with tension. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Joshua Miller, stood and addressed the court. Miller was a charismatic and relentless attorney, his reputation for delivering hard-hitting closings well known in Everdale. Today, he was poised, ready to ensure that justice for Sarah Anderson would not be derailed. Your Honor, Miller began, pacing before the jury, this trial is not simply about the crime James Anderson committed, but about the intentions and motivations that reveal just how premeditated his actions were. Over the next few days, we will prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that nothing about Sarah Anderson's tragic death was accidental. This was a calculated, selfish act. He turned sharply toward the jury. The defendant wanted control. He wanted the money, the house, the children, and he decided the only way to secure that control was to extinguish Sarah Anderson's life, a wife, a mother, a woman who trusted him. He betrayed all of that trust, and for what? For his belief that he could erase her and start fresh. But justice is not so easily eluded. Maria nodded quietly to herself as Miller spoke, her mind replaying the hours she had spent unraveling the evidence, a bloodied canvas bag, Sarah's jewelry hidden in the closet, the cowardly attempt to burn a photo in the backyard. It was all leading to this moment. James's defense attorney, a reserved man named Daniel Polk, stood, his demeanor apologetic. He glanced briefly at James before turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, the death of Sarah Anderson is an unspeakable tragedy. No one in this courtroom, least of all my client, denies this. However, he took a slow, deliberate breath. We ask you to consider the circumstances. James Anderson has admitted his guilt. He has made no attempt to excuse his actions, but it is crucial to understand the psychological pressure he was under. Maria frowned slightly, leaning toward Hargrove. Here we go, she muttered. Let's see just how far they're willing to spin this emotional breakdown nonsense. Polk continued. James was a man drowning in financial instability, living under constant judgment and hostility within his marriage. This was not premeditated murder. This was the act of a broken man who snapped in a moment of weakness and regret. We ask you to deliver a sentence that reflects not only justice, but also compassion. Hargrove leaned over to Maria and whispered, Compassion for choking your wife to death. Some nerve. Maria's eyes stayed fixed on James, who hadn't looked up since the start of the proceedings. If there was any remorse lurking behind his blank expression, she couldn't find it. May 18, 2023, 11:30 a.m. Closing arguments. The trial moved swiftly, with the prosecution laying out its case in painstaking detail. Miller had called Maria to the stand to recount the crime scene discovery, and she had described everything with surgical precision: the dirt-streaked canvas bag, the heavy drag marks, and James's every attempt to hide his role. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence, the jewelry, and the DNA, all pointing unerringly to James. And then came the financial records. Months of bank statements showing Sarah's dominant role as the breadwinner, coupled with text messages in which Sarah had expressed her frustration with James's refusal to take on more responsibility. When it came time for closing arguments, Miller's final words cut deep. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, standing directly in front of the jury box, "Sarah Anderson deserved a loving husband and a peaceful life. What she got instead was manipulation and betrayal. James Anderson did not kill her out of panic. He killed her because he saw her as an obstacle to the life he wanted, a life based on selfishness and entitlement. You now hold the power to deliver the justice that Sarah deserves and to tell James Anderson that his actions will not go unanswered." Polk's closing argument, in contrast, was a subdued plea for leniency, emphasizing James's internal struggles and painting Sarah as an unforgiving partner. But Maria knew the jury wasn't buying it. She could see it in their hardened expressions. May 20th, 2023, 3:15 p.m., the verdict. The jury filed back into the courtroom and the tension was palpable. As the four-person stood, the room fell silent. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Carter asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the four-person replied. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, James Anderson, guilty." A gasp rippled through the gallery as Sarah's family clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces. Maria exhaled slowly, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it would never bring Sarah back. June 15, 2023, 9 a.m., sentencing. When sentencing day arrived, Judge Carter wasted no time. Her voice was firm, unshaken. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "your actions were not a moment of blind rage but a calculated attempt to destroy another human being for your own gain. Sarah Anderson was more than your wife. She was the mother of your children, a pillar of this community, and a woman who deserved to live a full and happy life. You took that from her, and in doing so, you destroyed your own." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." James remained emotionless, his head slightly bowed. As the bailiff placed the cuffs on his wrists and escorted him from the courtroom, Maria leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with the gravity of what had unfolded. "Justice served," Hargrove said quietly, standing beside her. Maria nodded, though the weight of Sarah's absence was still heavy in the air. For Sarah, for everyone she left behind. With that, Maria stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight hitting her face as she prepared to move on to the next case. One more battle for justice in a world that seemed to grow darker every day. The Pursuit of Justice and Heart-Wrenching Lessons. June 16, 2023, 6 p.m. The Everdale Sheriff's Office was quieter than usual. Phone lines, which had been ringing non-stop for weeks during the investigation and subsequent trial, now sat silent. Just outside the office windows, the summer sun was setting over Main Street, casting a warm, orange glow. Inside, Detective Maria Ruiz sat in the break room, with a lukewarm cup of coffee in her hands. Sheriff David Hargrove stood near the window, leaning against the frame as he watched the faint movements of townsfolk wrapping up their day. "You'd think there'd be some kind of satisfaction in a conviction like this," Maria began, her voice low and reflective. Hargrove turned slightly but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I mean, we got him. The evidence, the confession, the verdict. It was so airtight even his attorney couldn't make much of a case for him," she went on, staring down into her cup as though the black liquid held some answers she hadn't found yet. "But I don't feel it, Dave. I don't feel any relief." He sighed, walking over to the table and pulling out the chair across from her. "Because it's not about us, Maria. And it never was. The town got their justice. Sarah's family got closure, or at least some version of it. That's what we're here for. That's what we did." Maria's lips curled into a weak smile as she set the cup down. "Yeah, I know, but it still feels empty, doesn't it? Like, no matter how many life sentences he gets, it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't undo months, years of pain she probably endured in that marriage. And it never will, Hargrove replied matter-of-factly. Justice is clean on paper, but it's messy as hell where it matters. You're always gonna wish you could have done more. That's just the way you're wired. He paused, softening his tone. But you can't carry every victim with you forever, Ruiz, case by case. That's how this job beats you down if you let it. Maria let out a dry laugh. Easy for you to say. You've been in this business long enough to get thick skin. And you've been in it long enough to know not to let it go to your heart, but you still do. Hargrove shot back, this time with faint warmth behind his words. And that's what makes you a damn good detective. Just don't let it eat you alive. She nodded quietly, appreciating his words, but still uneasy with the weight of what she was feeling. June 18th, 2023, 11 a.m., Sarah's memorial plaque dedication. 2 days later, Maria and Hargrove attended the unveiling of a memorial plaque for Sarah Anderson at the community park, where she had often taken her 2 daughters to play. The podium had been set up near the flower garden, and townsfolk from all corners of Everdale had gathered, their hushed conversations mingling with the chirping of birds and the occasional laughter of children too young to comprehend the grief in the air. Sarah's sister, Carol, stood at the podium, dressed in black but holding herself tall and composed. She began her speech in a calm voice, though the underlying anguish was unmistakable. Sarah was more than my sister. She was a mother, a damn good one, a loving friend, and someone who built her life on kindness and determination. She deserved more. She deserved to grow old, to see her girls graduate, to live a life that wasn't cut short by violence and cruelty. Maria's chest tightened as Carol continued. But if there's one thing Sarah taught me, Carol went on, it's this: don't let tragedy define who you are. Don't let fear stop you from speaking up, from asking for help, from letting people see what you're going through. She's not just a victim. She's a voice, a reminder that we all have to look out for each other, even when it's hard, even when the truth is ugly. As the plaque was unveiled, Maria felt her throat tighten. The dedication read, "In loving memory of Sarah Anderson, a mother and friend who deserved more." Hargrove, standing beside her, shifted uncomfortably. "You okay, Maria?" "Yeah," she said softly, wiping a stray tear before it could fall. I wish we could have stopped it before it got this far." "We did what we could," Hargrove replied. "Sometimes that's all we've got to give." June 20th, 2023, 7:45 p.m. Maria's desk in the Everdale Sheriff's Office. That night Maria sat alone at her desk, the dull hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound in the room. Spread out before her were files from Sarah's case. The photos, the witness statements, the forensic logs. She would eventually have to close these files and archive them, but something held her back. Her phone vibrated with a text message. It was from Carol. "Thank you, Detective Ruiz. You gave us the truth, and even though it hurts, we can finally start to heal. You'll always be part of the reason we found peace." Maria stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, "Sarah deserved that much." As she set the phone down, her thoughts drifted, not to the loss but to what had been gained. The town had come together stronger than ever before. People were talking openly about domestic abuse, about control and manipulation, about the signs they had ignored in Sarah's case. Her death wasn't just a headline or a courtroom saga, it was a catalyst for change. Maria leaned back in her chair, exhaling a long, heavy breath. The job wasn't ever going to get easier, and justice was never going to feel perfect. But for now, the people who mattered most, Sarah's daughters, her sister, her parents, had something they could hold on to. The truth. And in this line of work, sometimes the truth was the closest you could get to redemption. "You off soon?" Hargrove's voice startled her as he walked in with his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Thinking about it," Maria replied with a faint smile. "Well, don't sit here all night," he said, leaning on her desk. "There'll be more cases tomorrow, you know. Some other poor soul who needs you to pull another miracle out of nothing." "Yeah, I know," Maria said. "One case at a time." "One case at a time," Hargrove agreed, tapping the edge of her desk before walking toward the door. As Maria finally closed Sarah's file and locked the drawer, she felt the heaviness in her chest begin to lift, if only slightly. She grabbed her coat from the back of her chair and headed for the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet office. The shadows of Sarah's case would linger, but they would no longer consume her. For now, justice had done its job.